Hello dear learners, welcome to the class. Topic for today's discussion is why should we obey the state, issues of political obligation and civil disobedience, part 3. One of the important issues which comes under the concept of political obligation, that is to register our dissent, our resistance to the authority in a non-violent way. We shall be discussing this topic under the following headings: Introduction, Political Obligation and Right to Resist, Resistance and Civil Disobedience, Meaning, Henry David Thoreau, John Rawls, Features of Civil Disobedience, Mahatma Gandhi and Civil Disobedience, Conclusion. Introduction. The concept of civil disobedience movement has become an important element in the political power structure in contemporary world. This movement has spread around the world. It has been exemplified by Mahatma Gandhi during Indian freedom struggle, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the civil rights movement in the United States, the People's Power movement in the Philippines, the non-violent collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, Nelson Mandela against the apartheid government in South Africa, and so on. The success of Gandhiji and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had a lot to do with the emergence of Satyagraha as an organizational power. To discuss about the history of the 20th century without exploring the impact of civil disobedience and Satyagraha is to malign the very basis of the people's movement and the study of social science. The Gandhian method of civil disobedience and Satyagraha has given a new dimension to the concept of statecraft. So, the students, in modern times, the concept of civil disobedience has gained a very important in the power structure in the contemporary political theories as well as in the amongst the governments. This concept of civil disobedience has been popularized by Mahatma Gandhi in India, Martin Luther King Jr. in United States, and Nelson Mandela against the apartheid regime in South Africa. The emergence of civil disobedience movement as an organizational tool to resist the authority and government in a non-violent way is a very important contribution to the political theory. This concept of civil disobedience has given a new dimension to the whole concept of statecraft. Political obligation and right to resist. The idea of political obligation not only informs people to obey the authority of power of those in power, it also desires them to be critical about the way authority is exercised. They should scrutinize the actions of their rulers and resent in the event of an invasion on their liberties. Thus, the idea of political obligation also involves the idea of resistance to authority. The people not only obey the laws of the state or the commands of the sovereign, they also scrutinize those orders in terms of satisfaction they seek from life, and from time to time they reject them on the ground that they are a denial of those satisfactions. Obedience, that is to say, is the normal habit of mankind, but marginal cases continually recur in which the decision to disobey is painfully taken and passionately defended. Even great liberals like John Locke, T.H. Green have recognized the circumstances under which people may demonstrate their resistance and go to the extent of changing the political order. T.H. Green, in his lectures on the principles of political obligation, has rightly said, the functions of government are to bring in those conditions of freedom which are conditions of the moral life. If it ceases to serve this function, it loses its claim on our obedience. Thus, the whole case of political obligation may be said as: there are good grounds for accepting authority in general, but there may be good grounds for rejecting it in particular cases too. So, students, the concept of political obligation, that is the reason behind our justification to the obedience to the authority, laws and commands of the state, informs us to obey, but it also includes in its ambit the right to resist the authorities, right to resist the unjust rulers. The people not only obey the laws and commands of the state, but they also scrutinize those laws and commands in terms of the satisfaction they seek from those laws, and from time to time they reject those laws as a denial of those satisfaction. So we see that the great political thinkers like John Locke, T.H. Green have also admitted the right to resist in their political concepts. So the case of political obligation includes the right to resist also, resistance and civil disobedience. With the development of state and its complex functions, many tools were required to maintain the peace and stability, and rule of law is one among them. We have already discussed that while law and its obedience are necessary, but what if law formulation is biased and not transparent in nature? What if law is repressive or unjust in character? Do the individuals have the right to resist? Right to resist has occupied an ambiguous position in the study of politics. Modern philosophers like John Locke regard the right to resist as a natural right of the individuals, whereas in practice modern Western states treat actual political acts of resistance as illegitimate, if not criminal in all cases. Resistance in the study of politics is an action to register one's dissent against the government. Many times resistance, law breaking and civil disobedience are used as synonym. Since the focus of the study is civil disobedience, it has to be understood that these are different terms with different meaning. Students, an individual cannot be made bound to follow an unjust law in the name of political obligation. The mutual relationship between the individual and the state requires a continuous adjustment, and when the state is not ready for changing its unjust laws which are against the individual and which are not following the constitutional methods, the only option which is left with the individual is to resort to the method of civil disobedience. Throughout the long history of human civilization, there has always been conflict between the individual freedom and political authorities of the state. The freedom to choose or obey the dictates of the state has or laws has always been the basic theme of the concept of civil disobedience. Meaning and definition. Civil disobedience, also called passive resistance, is the refusal to obey the demands or commands of a government or occupying power without resorting to violence or active measures of opposition. Its usual purpose is to force concessions from the government or an occupying power. Civil disobedience is the non-violent way of registering dissent by breaking a law on moral grounds. Disobedience implies deliberately disobeying an unjust authority. I am breaking an unjust law. The duty of civil disobedience, an unjust law, is the counterpart of the duty of civil obedience. Who are just? Law civil disobedience may be resorted to as a protest against an unjust policy of government or in order to draw attention of the government to demand for political reform. Students, by civil disobedience we understand a passive resistance to the authorities, to the government, in which individuals refuse to obey the laws, policies, formulations and commands of the government or the occupying power without resorting to any sort of violence. That is, they demand certain concessions or changes in the laws. Civil disobedience is a non-violent way of registering our dissent by breaking the laws of the state on moral grounds, that is, respecting the laws which are higher than the laws formulated by the state. James Luther Adams has given what most theorists would accept as a complete definition of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is a non-violent public violation of a specific law or set of laws or a policy of government having the effect of law, which expresses a sense of justice in a civil society of cooperation among equals and which is generally undertaken in the name of a presumed higher authority than the law in question, as a last resort for the purpose of changing the law and with the intention of accepting the penalty which the prevailing law imposes. James Luther Adams has given a very adequate definition of civil disobedience, that is, it is a non-violent public violation of specific set of laws with the sense of demanding a change in the law and the purpose of changing the law with the intention of accepting penalty provided by the law. The concept of civil disobedience is very important in a democratic society, as it not only touches the moral limits of a majority rule but also forces us to reflect on the justifications for majority rule itself. Political theorists in the pre-modern as well as in the early modern periods were more concerned with the right to rebel, but the fundamental question raised in the concept of civil disobedience in a modern society is, how is it possible to have a general respect for the rule of law at the same time and yet gain the legitimacy to break the specific law as well? This is the question which is posed by the concept of civil disobedience. Henry David Thoreau. The term civil disobedience was coined by Henry David Thoreau in his essay The Relation of the Individual to the State, 1849, to describe his refusal to pay the state poll tax implemented by the American government to prosecute a war in Mexico and to enforce the fugitive slave law. Civil disobedience for Thoreau is not simply an act of law breaking, rather, conscience and duty is the central aspect of the argument. His famous essay opens with the maxim that government is the best which governs least. He argues that the state came into existence to ensure individual freedom, and using the example of the Mexican War, he appeals the moment it starts hindering the law and civil disobedience purpose for which it was instituted, it is the moral duty of the individuals to resist the unjust laws in order to obey a higher law. Students, the idea or this concept of civil disobedience was introduced to the modern Western political theory by Henry David Thoreau. He is widely accredited with the coining of the term civil disobedience. Thoreau for several years refused to pay his state poll tax as a protest against the institution of slavery, the extermination of the Native Americans and the war against Mexico. When Thoreau refused to pay the state poll taxes, he was imprisoned, and in a public lecture which Thoreau delivered twice in 1848, he justified his tax refusal and he justifies his tax refusal as a way to withdraw his support with the government, and also asked and called upon his fellow townspeople also to do the same. Since that time, civil disobedience has been considered as a way, as a mechanism of expression of citizens' interest against the disagreement towards the government with the authorities, and a mode of citizens' inclusion in the functioning of democracy. The philosophical roots of civil disobedience lie deep in Western thought. Cicero, Thomas Aquinas, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson and Henry David Thoreau all sought to justify conduct by virtue of its harmony with same antecedent superhuman moral law. In the contemporary world, it was popularized by Tolstoy, Martin Luther King, and Mahatma Gandhi. The justifications of civil disobedience at length also got place in the writings of John Rawls. Harold J. Lasky has cited the case of conscientious objectors to military service during the period of First World War, who had to undergo punishment for refusing to render military service, as they believed in peaceful solution of all human disputes. The modern concept of civil disobedience was most clearly formulated by Mahatma Gandhi. Drawing from Eastern and Western thought, Gandhi developed the philosophy of Satyagraha, which emphasizes non-violent resistance to evil. Students, the concept of civil disobedience was philosophically developed by political thinkers like Cicero in the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, and Henry David Thoreau. In the modern times, this concept was popularized by Tolstoy, Martin Luther King in America, Mahatma Gandhi in India, and in the writings of John Rawls. Tolstoy focused on the conscience while discussing on civil disobedience, which he called as the law of the love. He said we should oppose evil not by evil means, but by a very non-violent way. That is, we should oppose evil by every righteous means and not by evil. Similarly, Martin Luther King in America was an African American Baptist. He also advanced the cause of civil disobedience, and he worked for the rights of the black citizens in the United States, which also fetched him a Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Now, John Rawls' views on civil disobedience. Relatively in modern times, this concept was profoundly developed by another American, John Rawls, in his fundamental book, Theory of Justice, 1971. According to Rawls, civil disobedience is a public, non-violent, conscientious, yet political act, contrary to law, usually done with the aim of bringing about a change in the law or policies of the government. According to John Rawls, civil disobedience is a public, non-violent and conscious act opposed to law, which is undertaken with an objective of bringing about changes in governmental policies and laws. It essentially involves a conception of justice, which acts as a point of reference to the citizens to regulate their political affairs and to interpret the Constitution. He regarded it as a political act within the limits of obedience to the rule of law, with the objection to the restoration of democratic norms and procedures which have been otherwise ignored. He provided that right of civil disobedience can be exercised only when the principle of equal liberty and considerable equality of opportunity are violated and minorities are victims for a long time and other modes of legal redressal are not available. Students, Rawls has also suggested two main conditions for justifying the act of civil disobedience. First, he says civil disobedience should be very selective, that is, instances of substantial and clear injustices, namely violations of equal basic rights or equality of opportunity should be there. Next condition justifying the civil disobedience is that all the legal means have already been tried out, that is exhausted, which means it should be treated as a extreme and last resort. Now, features of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience may be defined as selective and public performance of actions, commissions or omissions truly believed to be illegal for reasons which agents take to be morally compelling. There are certain peculiar characteristics of civil disobedience which can be understood as following. Non-violence. Civil disobedience is often defined as non-violent in character. Other definitions allow an act to be included under the banner of civil disobedience if it involves violence which was not instigated by protesters but by opponents or by the police, or was solely against property. However, in its classical sense, it has to be completely non-violent. Rawls states that violent acts are incompatible with civil disobedience as a mode of address. Indeed, says Rawls, any interference with the civil liberties of others tend to obscure the civilly disobedient quality of one's act. So, first and foremost feature and condition for civil disobedience is non-violent, that is, it should be completely free of any sort of violence. Next is conscientiousness. One of the most highlighted feature of civil disobedience is that it is based on the foundation of sincerity and moral conviction of its practitioner. The deliberate and principled features of civil disobedience are often brought together under the umbrella of conscientiousness and equated with seriousness, sincerity, depth of conviction and selflessness, again in order to contrast civil disobedience with criminal law breaking. As in Mahatma Gandhi's Satyagraha, moral purity and insistence on truth is central to the concept. For Rawls, civil disobedience is needed only when the policy makers have not respected the principles of justice. Thus, conscience, morality and justice are one of the most important aspects of civil disobedience. So, again students, the acts of civil disobedience are undertaken out of sincere moral conviction by the individuals and not out of any self interest or group interest. They are often undertaken with the intention of best interest of the society at heart. That is, moral purity and insistence on truth is central to the concept of civil disobedience. Next is aimed at changing the law. Civil disobedience must aim at changing the law. In this way, it is a method of political engagement. Its goal must be to bring the law in conformity with the requirements of justice. Students, civil disobedience aims at changing the law, that is, it aims at bringing about or removing the injustices which is there in the law and to bring law in conformity with the justice. Next is communication. Practitioners of civil disobedience generally have both forward looking and backward looking aims. They seek not only to convey their disavowal and condemnation of a certain law or policy, but also want to draw public attention and thereby to instigate a change in law or policy. Typically, their messages call for reforms or redress and their audience is the majority. Civil disobedience is variously described as an act by which one addresses the sense of justice of the majority of the community as a plea for reconsideration and as a symbolic appeal to capacity for reason and sense of justice of the majority. Even when scholars expand the central criteria of civil disobedience, they agree that civil disobedience is essentially communicative. In comparison, other types of principled disobedience are not necessarily communicative. So, students, civil disobedience is understood as a communicative act, a kind of symbolic speech which aims to convey a message to audiences such as government and public. Civil disobedience are thought to contribute to the arguments in the public sphere. Next is publicity. This feature is a mandatory condition according to Rawls for an act to be considered that of civil disobedience. He asserts that civil disobedience is a communicative act where the majority is being given fair notice of an unjust law. It also includes not only providing information through a covert action, rather it is an appeal or address to the majority. Thus, the civil disobedient is willing to accept the penalties for law breaking. The idea is to make the audience uncomfortable with the thought that whether they really want to punish a moral individual for resisting a draconian law. Apart from the above discussed features, Rawls also suggests that civil disobedience must take place within the fidelity to law. The aim of civil disobedience is not to threaten the stability of the political system, rather it seeks to strengthen it by removing injustice, such that the system will be able to instill improvements. In this sense, the civil disobedient seems to demonstrate their faithfulness to the higher law. So, students, a next feature of civil disobedience is its publicity. Civil disobedience has to be communicative and has to be publicly announced. A civil disobedient should be ready to bear the punishment being provided by the state or authority. And the aim of civil disobedience is not to disturb or not to threaten the stability of the political system, rather it seeks to strengthen it by removing the injustices in the system. Mahatma Gandhi and civil disobedience. Mahatma Gandhi is considered to be the leading theorist in the history of civil disobedience movement. The Gandhian concept of civil disobedience and satyagraha is the greatest contribution to mankind in our times. Gandhiji called his concept of civil disobedience as the doctrine of satyagraha or truth force. For him, the adjective civil in the phrase civil disobedience referred to peaceful, courteous and a civilized resistance. To him, the concept of passive resistance is inadequate to grasp the full implications of the concept of satyagraha. He said that one must not only resist passively the injustice and arbitrariness of the government, but also must do so without any feeling of animosity. Students, the concept of non-violent civil disobedience secures central position in the Gandhian thought. Gandhiji was very much greatly influenced by Tolstoy and Thoreau, and from there he took the doctrine of civil disobedience, and it is an active, strong and extreme form of satyagraha, a term coined by him. Gandhiji in his journal Harijan said that it conceived as a substitute for violence or armed rebellion. It is a non-coercive method which any law-abiding citizen can adopt, provided he is saturated with the spirit of non-violence and is ready for utmost sacrifices. Thus, civil disobedience for Gandhiji should be used as a last resort, is a complete, effective and bloodless substitute of armed revolution or revolt. Mahatma Gandhi sought to combine the principle of civil disobedience with his principle of non-violent struggle and satyagraha, the principle of insistence on truth. Gandhi used civil disobedience method during India's freedom struggle. Gandhi set a practical example of civil disobedience when he led the march to the seashore in 1930 to defy the ban on making salt by the Indians. This ban was imposed by the British colonial rulers, which was thought to be unjust by Gandhiji and his followers. Gandhiji firmly believed that civil disobedience was based on a profound respect for law in general. Only unjust laws should be broken, that too when all methods of persuasion and petition for withdrawal of such law had been tried and had failed. The act of disobedience should be performed non-violently and in full public view, and penalties entailed by this act should be accepted willingly. It is again important that the true object of civil disobedience is change of heart of the authorities concerned. This should be resorted to only against a tyrannical regime, foreign rule or unjust government. If a government generally maintains the citizens' rights and can be influenced through democratic means, resort to civil disobedience will not be necessary. Finally, civil disobedience should not be resorted to for pressing the demands of any particular section against the general public or interest. Students, Gandhiji firmly believed that civil disobedience should be profoundly based on the rule of law, respect for law, and only the unjust laws should be broken. Then civil disobedience should be performed in a full public view, and the civil disobedience should be ready to entail all the penalties and should be ready to bear all the penalties entailed by this their act, and they should bear it willingly. Again, for Gandhiji, civil disobedience was basically for the change of the heart of the authorities concerned. As Gandhiji very often said, we should not hate the sinner, hate the sin, not the sinner, and this should be resorted to against a tyrannical regime, a foreign rule, or an unjust government. And next, Gandhiji said civil disobedience should be resorted to for pressing a genuine general demands of any particular section, and not of any for any self interest of any particular groups. Conclusion. On a concluding note, it can be said that most widely accepted account of civil disobedience is a public, non-violent and conscientious breach of law undertaken with the aim of bringing about a change in laws or government policies. On this account, people who engage in civil disobedience operate at the boundary of fidelity to law, have general respect for their regime, and are willing to accept the legal consequences of their actions as evidence of their fidelity to the rule of law. It aimed to establish a coherent, just and peaceful society. History has provided enough evidence that civil disobedience is efficient not only in providing political freedom but also against exploitation, oppression, social injustice and social evils. The theory of civil disobedience helps in instilling the values of rule of law as it limits majoritarianism and becomes the voice of subaltern in a democracy. Thus, it can be said that civil disobedience helps human beings in retaining a degree of moral autonomy vis-a-vis the state. So, students, civil disobedience is a ritualistic violation of the law rather than the rejecting the whole political system as a whole. Civil disobedience finds legitimate avenues and feels obligated by a higher law, extra legal principle to break some specific government laws, and civil disobedience we see has played a very important role in the theory and practice of human liberation movements across the globe. It has continued to inspire social political movements throughout the world. Civil disobedience is today widely used as a strategy to ensure social justice throughout the world. So, students, with this we come to the end of today's lecture. We have discussed about the concept of civil disobedience, we have discussed its meaning, we have discussed the views of Henry David Thoreau, John Rawls on civil disobedience, various features of the civil disobedience, and most importantly Mahatma Gandhi and his role in civil disobedience movements. Thank you.